Hello, I'm Eddie O'Sullivan, and this week in the Second World War. In this week in the Second World War, brought to you by the International Second World War History Network. In 1939, on the 12th of November, deportation begins of Polish Jews to the general government. Belgium and the Netherlands offer mediation to end the war. German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop tells Belgian and Dutch envoys that Germany was turning down their offer 2 days later. And a Finnish delegation in Moscow breaks off negotiations. In 1940, on the 11th of November, the Battle of Taranto begins, and Vyacheslav Molotov meets Hitler in Berlin. On the 14th of November, Coventry is bombed. On the 15th of November, Isoroku Yamamoto is made admiral, and on the 16th of November, the Warsaw Ghetto is officially sealed. In 1941, on the 10th of November, a British commando raid is launched on the headquarters of Erwin Rommel, and Japan's Pearl Harbor Strike Force begins departing the Kure naval base. On the 14th of November, the Ark Royal is abandoned to sink some 12 hours after being torpedoed. On the 15th of November, the Germans renew the drive on Moscow after a 3-week lull, and on the 16th of November, the German 11th Army capture Kerch on the Crimean Peninsula. In 1942, on the 10th of November, Admiral Darlan agrees to a ceasefire in French North Africa. German forces begin the occupation of Vichy, France, that day. On the 11th of November, the Battle of El Alamein ends in Allied victory. On the 12th of November, the Italian army occupies Monaco. The next day, the 8th Army captures Tobruk. On the 15th of November, the naval battle of Guadalcanal ends in American victory, and on the 16th of November, the Kokoda track campaign ends in Allied victory, and the Battle of Bunagona begins. In 1943, on the 12th of November, the Battle of Riros begins, and the Battle of the Treasury Islands ends in the Pacific. On the 13th of November, work is completed on the XB-80 jet fighter. On the 14th of November, the Battle of the Coconut Grove ends in Allied victory. The Manifesto of Verona is issued by the Fascist Republican Party, and Bulgaria is bombed for the first time. On the 15th of November, Heinrich Himmler orders nomadic gypsies and part gypsies to be placed in concentration camps. Karl Dönitz calls off U-boat operations in the Western Atlantic, and the Fifth Army assault on the Bernhardt Line in Italy is suspended. On the 16th of November, the Battle of Leros ends when Allied troops surrender. The Italian Social Republic orders the arrest and deportation of Jews. In 1944, on the 10th of November, the roundup begins of 50,000 men in Rotterdam for forced labour in Germany, and the Allies recognise the government of Albanian partisan leader Enver Hoxha. On the 11th of November, the Battle of Olmutz Bay begins in the Camote Sea in the Philippines, and the remaining German troops withdraw from Greece. On the 12th of November, the RAF sinks the Tirpitz in Tromsø. On the 13th of November, the Bulgarian army captures Skopje. On the 14th of November, Albanian partisans liberated Durrës. And on the 16th of November, the 1st and 9th Armies begin an offensive against the German Siegfried Line. In 1945, on the 13th of November, the US and the UK create a joint commission of inquiry to examine the question of European Jews and Palestine, and the French Constituent Assembly elects Charles de Gaulle President of the Provisional Government of France. Well, there you are. We've gone through all 5-6 years of the Second World War, looking at dates. We're going to be discussing those in detail with Joe Quinn and with our special guest, Ian Pegg. Before I start, I just want to talk about something I've done this evening, and keep your eye open for it. It's a new film, The Last Burma Star. So it was shown today, and I was there at the Speaker's House in the Houses of Parliament, a magnificent place in the Westminster. And the film is about a 101-year-old Burmese man who served with the British Army in the Second World War. And they took the Burma Star to present it to him. So it was really quite moving. Anyway, there you are. So I'm now going to bring in our co-host, Joe Quinn. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Eddie. How are you?
Also, Ian Pegg. So Ian Pegg, I mean, Joe Quinn needs no introduction. Ian Pegg is a specialist in the history of conflict. He's based in Yorkshire, which is the most important county in the United Kingdom. So you don't have to go any further than that anyway. So there we are. Now let me just move on. The starting point on this conversation, let me again put something up to get the conversation going, which is today, 11th of November, is of course Remembrance Day. And so in the United Kingdom, for more than 100 years, there's been commemorations of, first of all, the armistice of 1918. And then, of course, it was called Armistice Day, and now it's Remembrance Day. And this usually comprises a festival of remembrance in the Albert Hall. And this year, the lucky audience had that man, Rod Stewart, singing. Of course, the next day we had, that was on the Sunday, Remembrance Sunday, which is official commemoration. And this happens in Whitehall. If you know Whitehall, that enormous building is a cenotaph. It was built in 1920. And so every year on the Remembrance Sunday, there's a massive gathering. It's, in many respects, the closest thing the United Kingdom has to a national commemoration, because it unites all four nations, the United Kingdom. The King was there, and the Queen, the Prime Minister, and the leading politicians and ministers. And then there was a parade, including now, I think we had, 10 or maybe more men who had actually served in the Second World War, and then hundreds of others who marched in memory of the formations they're in. And this is, I'll show you this photograph. This is close to my heart because some of those chaps there are, with the Corbine and the cap badge over their right eye, they're from my father's regiment, the London Irish Rifles, and they marched past. And I think more or less the only person who hadn't served in the army was my brother, who's on the committee, and he's half his face. He's an extreme right in this picture, so he marched. Anyway, so let's talk about remembrance. And I have questions about the future of remembrance, particularly in the form that is taken. We call it Remembrance Sunday. The Americans call today Veterans Day. I think the French have a whole day off today, don't they? They have a bank holiday. Very small numbers of men who actually served in the Second World War, all of them close to 100. None of them can walk. They're all in wheelchairs. So where is remembrance going, and where should it go? Joe, what do you think?
Well, I think it's fair to say that remembrance culture is sadly on the decline. This is largely due to the fact that we are witnessing the disappearance of the last of the Second World War generation. And I think it would be fair to say that during their lifetime, there was a reverence and respect for the culture of remembrance and for the memory of those who had served in the world wars and in conflicts connected either before or after those conflicts, that now no longer seems to be. It seems that there has been a shift in terms of the culture. It might be to do with the times. It might be to do with the, I suppose, the political culture. Certainly the political classes in this country, as well as in other nations, still cleave to the whole idea of remembrance in terms of shoring up national mythologies that basically ensure national solidarity. And I'm talking about France in particular. I'm talking about this country. I'm talking about the United Kingdom. In the case of the Republic of Ireland, remembrance culture is rather new. It's new in the sense that of what people would recognize in this country, the introduction of remembrance culture in terms of the commemoration of the Irish soldier who served in British uniform is a rather new concept, and it seemingly is embraced, and it is growing exponentially, and it's something that I think will last the long gestation. But the fact of the matter is that in terms of remembrance culture, the passing away of these previous generations, particularly the Great War generation, have now gone. The Second World War generation have almost passed from our eyesight. And with their passing comes, I think, a watershed moment, a moment where things will certainly be different once the sun is set upon this generation. And as the living memory of the Second World War fades from view, there will be a shift in culture. And we saw this with the passing of the First World War generation, and we will see it with the Second World War generation. It's not a sign necessarily of decline or of a failing of moral values or the traditional values of society. I think it's just something that is a very natural result of the passage of time.
Yes, Ian, what's your perspective on it?
I think as historians and authors and those interested in World War II, it's our role to keep that memory of commemoration going. I think one of the things that we have to think about is how we educate our young people. And there was certainly on a lot of the commemorations on Sunday, a lot of young people out there who were at cenotaphs all around the country. I remember being, certainly as a cub and a scout, being taken along. But I think the nature of things changes as it moves forward. We are coming to, certainly my children will remember their grandfather just about, but the next generation after them will have not met any living descendants who fought in World War II, and how does that change their thinking? We have to remember that the king is the last of those that will have served perhaps under those that were in World War II. So him as a young man, as a Navy captain or Navy, whatever his role was in the Navy, he may have served under people who were directly involved in World War II. His mentor, Lord Mountbatten, and his father were directly involved. But once what happens next after that is quite interesting for me. But I think we have a duty to keep that message alive and keep those stories alive as historians and keep this day. It's important. We've got to remember it's not just about World War II. It's about commemorating all those that lost their lives from the United Kingdom, from the Commonwealth in World War II. And that's a really important message.
Well, I think time is coming when there needs to be a thorough reevaluation of the remembrance process. I think there's, dare I say, a little bit going through the motions. They've done what they've done for the last 100 years. I think things are changing. As I said, it's the closest the UK as to a national event. So the Americans have Independence Day, and everybody gathers and they have fun. They celebrate being American. The French have Bastille Day, and they celebrate being French. The Irish have St. Patrick's Day, and they celebrate being Irish. The United Kingdom doesn't have a day where we celebrate being United Kingdomish. And there's no greater moment in United Kingdom history than 1945. And it strikes me there needs to be some real, some fresh thinking to ensure that the memorialization, which we all agree is necessary, and it's not just history, there's an emotional element to it, is reviewed, and we come up with different approaches. Anyway, let's move on. I'm going to move on to 1940, Battle of Taranto. There you go. So, Battle of Taranto, November 1940. Taranto, as you can see in the maps, kind of obscured by the Taranto is a major Italian base in the Mediterranean, right down on the heel of Italy. And in November 1940, the RAF carried out a most daring raid using those planes. I don't know what they're called. Somebody can tell me. But they worked on using submarines. It was very successful, not how many ships they destroyed, but it was a real great success. And of course, it had an influence on Japanese thinking, didn't it, lads? So let's review that moment. Joe.
They're called swordfish. And this is a biplane, basically. You think, by the time we get to the Second World War, biplanes would have been completely phased out, but the swordfish continues in service until 1943, and it's ultimately replaced by very poor replacements in the form of the Barracuda and other such basically naval aviation craft that are manufactured for specific purposes for the Royal Navy that are kind of barely up to the job. You also have the Royal Navy equips itself from late 42 with early 42, late 42 with what is actually known, it's called the Martel fighter plane, but actually they use these in the United States Navy during the Battle of Midway and various different variants moving forward. So it's basically like the mainstay fighter of the United States Navy. So they equip themselves with Grumman aircraft in the Royal Navy in order to basically provide fighter defenses. So they do outfit themselves with what, in terms of naval aviation, from the Allied perspective, is state of the art. But the fact of the matter is that the Royal Navy used swordfish for practically the vast majority of their most memorable victories over the German Navy. I mean, the Bismarck was sunk with the aid of naval aviation, the swordfish. You had a very great Irish hero, a VC winner, Eugene Esmond, making the attack on the Bismarck, and also at a later point, another battleship using swordfish, basically fighters that are fighter bombers that would basically be equipped with torpedoes. And their whole, basically, that's basically what their delivery mechanism was. Their primary aim was to deliver torpedoes. So they were torpedo bombers. They were incredibly vulnerable, but they were also remarkably durable for aircraft that were actually in many ways, some would say obsolete, but they performed incredibly well. And the attack at Taranto, using swordfish aircraft and using Royal Navy naval aviation, was sort of groundbreaking from both a Japanese and American perspective. Both the Japanese and Americans both concluded at the same time after the Taranto attack that such an attack would be very possible in the Pacific region. And it was very likely that the Japanese would be the first to inflict such a blow using naval aviation, using these tactics, and basically replicating the kind of model that had been used by the British during the particular attack on the Italian Navy at Taranto. And it's not for nothing that there was a Japanese naval attaché present at Taranto when the attack took place. And he would later return to Japan and he would communicate what he saw and the intelligence that he gathered from his Italian counterparts, as well as other intelligence about the Taranto attack, which played a very decisive part in terms of the formulation of the plan for attack devised by Isoroku Yamamoto when he devised the plan to attack Pearl Harbor in 1941.
Ian, any comments on the Taranto? Is a celebrated victory for the Royal Navy because these are all naval flyers.
Yeah, I think we have to remember, and Joe sort of touched on it there. It was the first ever ship-to-ship all-aircraft attack in history, and that's what led on to the Japanese. I think the other thing we have to remember is this was done at night, so this is an open cockpit fighter at night having to find their way out and back under devastating ground attack. I think there was something like over 100 anti-aircraft guns plus whatever was on the ships, and for it to be relatively successful, and it was a relatively small number of swordfish that went in. I think it was about 20, 25 swordfish in total went in, and the damage they caused to the Regia Marina, the first squadron of the Italian Navy, and it meant that the Navy actually evacuated Taranto and went back to Naples for repairs. And I think it's a vital battle for those reasons. I think it was interesting. There was a number of aircraft lost, which we have to remember that. But in terms of the damage done, I think it was something like 3 battleships disabled, a heavy cruiser damaged, 2 destroyers damaged. So it was very significant, especially so early in the war.
Yep. Okay. Well, let's move on. And in November 1940, this is the most astonishing photograph, I think, of the Second World War, because the Soviet foreign minister, the man with the hat on the left, and he's in the picture on the right as well, Molotov, turns up in Berlin in November for meetings with practically everybody who in the senior level in the German government, including Himmler, and meets Hitler. Very friendly. Look at that lovely friendly chat these guys are having. You have to bear in mind this is not much more than 6 months before the launch of the most terrible military campaign in human history. The guy I want to talk about, you see that guy in the middle, he's usually described as the translator. His name is Gustav Hilger, and he survived everything. So he was in Moscow working. He spoke fluent Russian. He was in Moscow all the way through. And at the end of the war, when the Barbarossa started, he went, I think, back to Berlin. And he was very much involved. He was really apparently aware of everything that was going on, including the atrocities. And after the war, he was one of the chaps who offered his services to Britain and America. And he was eagerly hired. His name is Gustav Hilger. And Stalin said, well, foreign ministers come and foreign ministers go, but Hilger is always there. This moment, Joe, what do you think was going through Stalin and Hitler's head at this point? Hitler had already decided he was going to invade, wasn't he?
Yeah, so Hitler had decided on the invasion of the Soviet Union, really not even towards the end of the Battle of Britain, but pretty much sort of halfway through it. I mean, the Battle of Britain had really not sort of taken off, forgive the pun, in August 1940, by the time Hitler was already poring over maps over Soviet territory, deciding on what...
What about Stalin then? What about Stalin? What was going through Stalin and Molotov said at this point?
With regard to Stalin, Stalin anticipated that an attack from Nazi Germany would be a likelihood at some point in the future. He was prepared to deal with that possibility as early as late 1941, possibly as late 42, early 43. He did not anticipate that Hitler would strike when he did. And it wasn't really part of his whole timeline when the actual invasion of the Soviet Union happened. He suspected that there might be an attempt, there might be a breakdown of relations. He certainly didn't anticipate that when relations between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were at the particular point that they were at, where the Soviet Union was sending vital resources to the German war effort. The trains were coming across the border from the Soviet Union into Nazi-occupied European territory, even at the moment that German troops were about to invade in June 1941. Stalin did not anticipate that this would actually occur on the scale that it did in 41. So what's going through his head is, yes, that this may well happen, but it's not going to happen anytime soon, because surely Hitler would not contemplate an attack of this particular kind at this early stage. He's certainly not ready. I think the Soviets, they're aware that there is a tension, and they are aware that there is the prospect of possible conflict, particularly when you have these two great powers that are moving in, annexing territory practically right beside one another. So you've got mobile, fissile you might say, frontiers going on between these two great powers. So there's inevitably going to be a clash. But you must remember, the Nazi-Soviet pact, when it was signed in late 1939, just before the outbreak of the Second World War, had the appearance to an international audience of being something along the lines of an alliance, of a coalition almost, between, unbelievably as it might sound, the leading fascist power in the world and obviously the key and leading communist power in the world. These two powers that were seemingly ideologically opposed, the idea that they would have formed an alliance of this kind or a pact of this kind seemed unthinkable to most people in the West, particularly in Western Europe, particularly in France, Britain, and especially the United States. So their coming together engendered a great deal of mistrust in the West of obviously both powers. But it was Stalin who proved the more naive of the two when it comes to the grasp or the grip on realpolitik that was held by both Hitler and Stalin. Stalin ultimately ended up coming a cropper in that, but not in the long run. As we will see, Hitler took on far more than he could chew, and he perhaps got his timing wrong.
Great. Ian, your perspective on this extraordinary moment is really incredible photograph in Berlin. Any perspectives to add to what Joe's just said?
Yeah, I think we have to remember about Molotov that he was central to a lot of what happened and playing both sides against the middle. And you look back at his history and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but he was so trusted by Stalin that when Germany invaded Soviet Union, it was Molotov that went on the radio and told the people that they were under attack, not Stalin. And it was Molotov then who held urgent negotiations with the British, and then flew to he flew to Scotland to speak to Eden, and then he flew to America to speak to Roosevelt. So it's all right thinking about what Hitler and Stalin were thinking, but Molotov is a key player in all of those negotiations, right from the beginning, being trusted by the Germans, then not trusted by the Germans, and then being trusted by the British, or being Stalin's point man against with the British and the Americans later on in the war. He's an interesting character, Molotov. Interesting character.
Well, of course, he died in '86, didn't he? So he
went on to serve in numerous positions and died later on. Yeah, very much.
He was just the sole survivor, and of course, Death of Stalin in the film, which I really quite enjoy.
Yeah,
played by Michael Palin, and he's depicted as being thick as a plague.
But I think if you look at his history, I think throughout his history, people regarded him as not being the brightest button, but it appears he had a very sharp mind. His negotiation skills were as good as anyone's, and he used that to his own advantage at times.
And he was highly educated.
Yeah, I would just want to come in on that point.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to come in on that point. One of the things I just want to say is there's a very famous episode where during the Battle of Britain, when the Blitz begins on Berlin, Molotov is involved in preliminary discussions with his counterpart, his Nazi German counterpart, Ribbentrop. And what happens is they're in the middle of having a dinner and they're having a state banquet, and an air raid siren goes off. And Ribbentrop is in the middle of having a discussion with Molotov about how they're on the cusp of crushing Britain, and then following from crushing Britain, and invading Britain and absolutely decimating the country and bringing it to heel. They will later go after the British Empire. And Ribbentrop gives out this very long, elaborate sort of explanation about how they're going to accomplish this. And he justifies this by the fact that he said, I was the ambassador to Britain. I was the ambassador to the court of St. James. I have a deep understanding of how this can be done. And he's going into this discussion with Molotov. And Molotov is smelling a rat pretty early on. He's sensing that all is not right. And then next thing, the air raid siren goes off, and they have to go down into the cellars beneath the building. I think it's in the Reich Chancery, where the dinner is taking place. And then basically, as the anti-aircraft guns and the first bomb hits are hitting hold in the city of Berlin, Ribbentrop returns in this corridor underneath the building, and he says, yes, as I was saying, we've got the British very firmly under control. And Molotov raises his finger and he said, yeah, it doesn't sound like it. So one of the things I would have to say about Molotov is that Molotov had a very realistic appreciation of what was taking place. I don't think Molotov was blind to the fact that the adversaries that he was negotiating with were his adversaries. I think at the end of the day, Molotov was sent in and I think he proved himself very capable of negotiating with the Nazi German government and perceiving correctly what their long-term objectives were going to be. And I think he advised Stalin accordingly. And there are numerous authors who've written about Molotov's diplomacy to the effect that he was not blinding Stalin as to what was coming his way when the time came. Perhaps he got the timing wrong.
Unlike Ribbentrop, he was, right, saying we can win this and I can win the British over. Anyway, look, 1941, I'm just putting something up here, which is the raid on Rommel's headquarters, November 1941. And his headquarters at this point, you see the north coast, you see Alexandria, and you can see Kure. The British front line was further west, obviously, into the Egyptian and Libyan desert. And this incredible raid was carried out in an attempt to kidnap or kill Rommel. And the people involved in this, and this is really quite interesting, is on the left is Keyes. Now, he was killed in this raid. He died in the raid. He got a VC posthumously. Some conflicting accounts whether he was shot by Germans or by his own side. But anyway, he got the VC. Now, his father, Roger Keyes, on the right, was an enormously influential figure in the First World War and in the Second World War. So Roger Keyes, I think it was in April 1940, he turned up in the House of Commons. He was an MP at this point, and he spoke out against the incompetence of the Neville Chamberlain government. He's generally considered to be a major figure in bringing down Neville Chamberlain and bringing in Churchill. Roger Keyes was a very big friend of Churchill. And I put the ship there at the bottom, just to put it in context. Born in 1872. So the first ship, or more or less the first ship that Roger Keyes ever sailed in is that one there, which is a sail ship. Obviously, by the point we're getting here, no sails, it's steam and heavy armament. So anyway, what do you think, this moment? Any observations on this, Joe?
Well, certainly, there's been a lot of very naff films been made throughout a particular period in film and Hollywood history, throughout the late 50s, 60s, 70s, like Raid on Rommel, Tobruk, and various different others, which touch upon special forces operations in North Africa. But the Raid on Rommel's headquarters is depicted perhaps slightly inaccurately by, in the film about Rommel, starring James Mason, that was done by 20th Century Fox. And the whole film opens with a submarine lying off a Royal Navy submarine lying off the coast of North Africa, and these commandos going ashore and storming Rommel's headquarters and whatever, and being rebuffed by what is essentially, it's a setup basically, and he's not even in the headquarters. The fact of the matter is that Rommel was a target for the British forces that was possibly a target that they would not have been able to get to very effectively, because of the fact that Rommel at that particular time was aided by very effective counterintelligence in Cairo at that very moment. it was one of the few periods throughout the entire Second World War where German intelligence actually worked to Germany's favor. But it only lasted really up until the end of 1942. At that particular moment, around late 41 to 42, the Axis managed to gain the upper hand in terms of the intelligence war, in terms of the North African campaign. There were double agents in Cairo. The Abwehr was operating relatively effectively, and also there was, believe it or not, a Sicherheitsdienst agent operating in Cairo for a while, that provided very effective intelligence. So Rommel was actually very well served at that particular moment, and there had been a certain level of infiltration in terms of understanding the intentions of British High Command within Cairo. So that was the unique set of circumstances that served to keep Rommel safe and to protect him at that particular moment. But it all changed sort of mid to late 1942, or leading up to the Battle of El Alamein, and the entire intelligence picture in terms of the North African campaign shifted against the Axis and in favor of the British. And really for the rest of the war, it all fell back into the Allied favor.
Okay, well, what about that particular moment? I picked it up because it is kind of unusual. The father-son relationship is fascinating. They say that the young officer, he was trying to impress his dad. Some people say that, you know, and he took these risks and he was killed. Of course, Roger Keyes died as a result of smoke inhalation in 1945. He was combat, and he was on a ship, an American ship in Leyte Gulf or in the Philippines. He was hit, inhaled smoke, and he died at the end of the year. Roger Keyes is an extraordinary figure, isn't he, Ian?
Yeah, I mean, you look at, I mean, the fact that you've got a father and a son who've made such an impact in World War II, and what they went through. I mean, Keyes, I think, is forgotten that he was a baron. He got various awards throughout his career, and his peerage. But in 30, we talk about World War II, and it has to be about World War II. We've got to remember, in World War I, he was really involved in things like the Dardanelles campaign, and he learned his craft in World War I, and then went on to serve as this great vice admiral type person.
Yes, and he had a dramatic. Michael Keegan, who I'm dealing with, he's doing a biography of Keyes. It's an astonishing story over 2 wars. Now let's move on to another thing in 1941, which is the sinking of the Ark Royal. There you are. There's the Ark Royal, British aircraft carrier, sunk in the November 1941. Well, it wasn't sunk; it was damaged by a torpedo, and it either sunk or scuttled in the Mediterranean. People say, in hindsight, that there was something wrong with the aircraft carrier. Any particular observations on this? And did this have the fact that such a major British ship, quite new, I think it was launched in the 1930s, a major British ship was knocked out, apparently comparatively easy, by submarines? Did this have an impact on British naval strategy in the Mediterranean and elsewhere in the Second World War, Joe?
I think it did have momentarily a very significant impact at that particular point. I mean, the knocking out of the Ark Royal, sort of precipitates a slight crisis in terms of, like, do we have enough aircraft? Like, I mean, bear in mind that the British basically go cap the United States Navy at a particular point around 1942 to, get a carrier, which they desperately need in the Pacific. They're very desperately short of carriers. They've lost the Lexington in the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Yorktown basically has gone at Midway, and then basically, they're only really left with the Enterprise, and they're swapping the Wasp, the USS Wasp, back and forth between the Atlantic and Mediterranean, the Atlantic and Pacific theaters, and they're sending the Wasp into the Mediterranean in order to supply Malta. So carriers do matter in terms of the Mediterranean sea campaign, but they're not absolutely crucial. The problem with the Mediterranean is you've got too much landmass all around. It's sort of, we're talking about a very limited sea space. You're not dealing with an ocean. You're talking about a sea space that's sandwiched between two continents, where the northernmost continent has all these isthmus, peninsulas and archipelagos that are stretching down and providing potential jump-off points for air cover right across that sea space. So it's very treacherous from an Allied perspective. And when you put a carrier in there, you're risking that carrier. You need to sail that carrier into a space where basically it's beyond Axis range. And the problem with the Ark Royal is also it can fall victim to U-boat attacks or to Italian submarine attacks. It's going to be a very vulnerable target, and it's the flagship really for the Royal Navy's aircraft carrier fleet, which have taken quite a bashing up until that particular point. The interesting thing, though, is by the time the Ark Royal is sunk, or basically is damaged beyond repair, and they have to let it sink at that particular point, is that they've got about 4 aircraft carriers basically in construction at naval, possibly 5 in shipyards right across the UK. That within, I think the first one within a matter of months with the sinking of the Ark Royal will be commissioned. There's going to be an Illustrious 2. There's going to be several other aircraft carriers that are going to be launched off the slipways. So the British industry and the Royal Navy are already anticipating the loss of these carriers, and they're ready to get new ones back into action to replace the ones that are lost. And in addition, American industry, American shipyards are going to be pumping out aircraft carriers at a rate of knots. They're going to have, by the end of the war, the Americans are going to have 101 aircraft carriers going. It's absolutely phenomenal. And we're talking about fleet carriers, we're talking about escort carriers. There's carriers that are basically not the massive things that basically, sort of support, like we're talking about the Essex class that they were using in the Pacific. We're talking about escort carriers that are miniature, they're small, they're just designed for, sending off what the British call Martel fighters. The name escapes me what the Americans are calling them at the time, but they're their mainstay escort fighter. And these are the fighters that they use for basically escort duties, for dropping the odd bomb on a U-boat that pops its conning tower above the waves every so often, and also basically intercepting any Axis aircraft that come in over the Atlantic. The fact of the matter is that by this particular point, British industry is caught up. They have been in total war mode since at least early to mid 1940, and the Americans basically they've geared into place, and they're already producing Liberty ships. They're able to turn around ships, merchant shipping, in about 48 to 72 hours, like a ship rolling off the slipways from scratch within 72 hours. That's the scale of the industry that the Axis are dealing with. So yeah, you can sink the Ark Royal, but there's a lot more shit coming down the line.
Right. Ian, what do you think about sinking Ark Royal? It gets attention and it was a shock, but inconsequential in the fuller scheme of things.
It was inconsequential, but I think what did come out of that, and I suppose one of the only good things that come out of that, it did demonstrate a weakness in the damage control, and how that was compounded by poor training of personnel, how to deal with extensive flooding in ships, and I think that because of that, future designs were looked at both in terms of how they would then control that damage control. Design changes were made to certainly the electrical power distribution, diesel generators. And I think that then went into the further aircraft carriers that were built, recognizing that weakness.
Good. Right, let's move on to 1942. We dealt with this quite extensively last week with Operation Torch on the 8th of November. But a couple of days later, the Germans then occupied the Vichy French zone. So if you look at the map, the German occupation zone agreed in 1940 is the yellow thing. The blue is the Vichy area, and then there's a green area which was actually occupied by the Italians, which actually included Monaco. So the Germans occupied the Vichy area. We talked about talks last week, but as you mentioned, Joe, last week, quite a profound implications for the Germans having to take over Vichy France.
Yes, I mean, in terms of the diversion of resources, you're talking about armor, you're talking about infantry. Like, I mean, we're talking about a minimum of 1/3 of the landmass of France that they suddenly have to go in and occupy, in addition to the part of France that they're already occupying. Massive diversion of resources. This is like, I mean, I gave you an anecdote about a German officer who's about to go to the Eastern Front, and suddenly he's pulled off the train where he's heading east, he's heading towards Poland, and then he's redirected west with his unit, his regiment. And there's probably, think about how many German regiments, think about how many German divisions, and all the manpower and all the material that's going to be diverted into Vichy. I mean, they're going to roll the armor in. The reason they're going to roll the armor in is because they have to secure the coast. So, their Vichy allies are done for, and they have to secure the whole of France at this particular point. What they do is they manage to kind of reinstate elements of the old Vichy regime, the civil service. They get the police on side, and so on and so forth. And they make sure that they're doing their jobs and that they continue the regime going, or the apparatus of the regime, in some form, and get them to do more what Berlin directs them to do. But the fact of the matter is that they have to enforce it, and they can no longer depend on the French collaborationists within either the military or the police to absolutely enforce what Berlin dictates. They've lost an ally. An ally, it was a false ally, it wasn't a real ally, it was illusory. But the fact of the matter is that the Vichy regime and the collapse of it, and then the diversion of resources that ensued from that, has a massive impact in terms of basically Germany's direction at that point in the war.
Ian, any thoughts on this moment, Vichy France?
I think, and I know you talked about Vichy France last week. It's I think there is still so much to understand about what happened and the wider impact, especially the recognition by America of Vichy France and how that went forward, and then the impact of the Germans having to reinvade in 42, November 42, and what that meant in terms of those relationships. So I think there's far more to come from that.
Okay, well, let's move on to the Far East now. And this week, November 1942, we got the Battle for the Kokoda Trail. So this is New Guinea, a huge area. This is the western part, Papua New Guinea, and the Kokoda Trail is marked between Port Moresby to Kokoda. Do you see that on the left? And this is the route, as you can see it now closer. So Port Moresby up through. This is really quite an important moment for the New Guinea campaign and for the Australian Army, Joe.
Yes, the Battle of the Kokoda Trail is the stuff of legend. I mean, I've talked about the Battle of Milne Bay that was going on alongside the battles that were going on the Kokoda Trail. And just to make a long story short, you look at a map of New Guinea, most people out there in the world don't really know where New Guinea really is. So, and it's Papua New Guinea. You got Papua to one side, and you got New Guinea on the other. And essentially the Australian army that was fighting in the Owen Stanley mountain range on the Kokoda Trail in that particular moment in 1942, ranging from basically early summer 1942 right up until basically midway, end of autumn 1942. They were fighting in some of the toughest conditions known to man, in the toughest terrain that any army of the war were fighting in. It was like up and down Razorback Mountains in jungle conditions, in absolutely boiling jungle temperatures. fighting an enemy that they very often couldn't see, getting involved in fights left, right, and centre, having to dig in on these sort of ridgeback positions and fight defensive actions, which the Australians became increasingly good at. And they learned that this was the kind of warfare that they could employ, but they were undersupplied. They didn't have enough food. They sometimes lacked ammunition. And also, even though they were very tough fighters and they were prepared, it was not for nothing that the Aussies were the first of the Allied forces in the Pacific region to actually give the Japs a bloody nose. They were really tough. They were really up for the fight. But the Japanese that they ended up meeting on the Kokoda track were elite troops. They were Japanese Marines. They were fairly brutal in terms of their tactics. Those prisoners, Australian prisoners that were captured, were treated absolutely horrific, tied to trees and used as bayonet practice. There's all sorts of horrific stuff that happened. And there's a very good movie that was released in 2005 called Kokoda. It was subsequently renamed the 39th, which was made by a filmmaker, an Australian filmmaker called Alistair Grierson, and it's called Kokoda. And it's a very visceral, very gritty, and actually very moving, like terribly moving movie about it. It lasts about an hour and a half long, and it's about the fight at Isoroku, this very famous stand that was made by the Australian 39th Battalion, which were known as Chocos. They weren't actually regular Australian infantry, like regular Australian army infantry. They were actually reservists. They were actually backups. They were actually the people that were supposed to be doing the heavy lifting and providing logistics and not doing the frontline fighting. But the 39th actually, even though that wasn't their job, actually ended up directly involved in a sort of a last stand delaying battle at Isoroku in order to allow the AIF, which is the Australian Imperial Force, deployed on the Kokoda track to make a strategic withdrawal back towards Port Moresby. And a famous speech was given by a colonel upon their withdrawal from Isoroku. It's a very famous, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but I would put it to you, I would submit it to you and to anybody who's watching. It is the best and it's the finest speech delivered by any human being throughout the entire Second World War. It is moving to listen to. It's succinct. It's poignant. I think it sums up war in a way that few speeches do. And it's spoken by a commander to his troops who recognizes the superhuman efforts that his troops have made, even though they went far and beyond what they were expected to do at that particular moment. So I would suggest watch the movie.
Ian, the Kokoda Trail, I think the Battle of the Kokoda Trail, seems to have emerging for Australians as the big, most famous battle of the Second World War. You can walk the track, it gets a lot of attention, documentaries about it. And the Australians are very proud about this battle, but am I right? I mean, it does get almost Gallipoli level attention in Australia.
It does, and I think the problem with that is there's a misconception that they were of the numbers involved. You got to remember the Australians. There were 30,000 Australians against about 13,500 Japanese. I think what was important for the battle itself and the recognition was, as Joe said, the terrain was horrendous. They weren't trained to fight in that sort of terrain, and it didn't help that there were some poor command decisions made against carrying heavy the Vickers medium and heavy machine guns and mortars into the jungle, which I think, if I remember rightly, led to some of the high-ranking Australian officers being sacked for what went on. But I think it's that mythology around it fits in with that Anzac legend is still sits there today. I think there were a lot of lessons learned, and we've got to remember with all of these battles in that sort of area, the amount of sickness that was suffered by the Australians. I think it's something like a sixth of the soldiers were significantly ill from jungle fever and other things while throughout the period of the 5 months of this battle.
Let's go to 43 and let's do that again. A unremembered event in the autumn of 1943, November 43, because you have to remember at this point the 8th Army was up to the Bernite line in Italy, and there was an attempt made, mainly British, to take Leros, and you can see it in the map there. And this was actually one of the biggest disasters in that year, well, certainly in the latter part of the year for British Army. The paratroopers, Germans, were dropped, and in the end, the battle was finished, as you can see, by the middle of November. And it was a bit of a disaster, Joe. Why did Britain do that? Was it entirely Churchill's fault?
Unfortunately, yeah, this was entirely Churchill's fault. It was an absolutely crazy idea. I mean, there was a series of small island campaigns that took place in the Dodecanese island chain, and basically a lot of islands around sort of the, shall we say, the Eastern Aegean, pretty much brushing up against the Turkish coast. And the whole tagline of the story of the Guns of Navarone really seizes in very closely on this. I mean, I think the backstory of the Guns of Navarone is really about Leros, and there are a number of islands which are invaded by the British with these small expeditionary forces of about 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 small forces, some of which succumb to German, basically offensives or joint German-Italian efforts to retake those islands and to basically seize those garrisons. And then there are also British evacuations from those islands. But it's part of this whole bizarre kind of obsession that Churchill seems to have with this entire region in this particular respect. I mean, he's very determined to make his stamp upon Greece, and it becomes something of a bit of a scandal. I mean, around the time of the controversy around the Battle of the Ardennes and whether or not the British were having a massive impact upon the second half of the Battle of the Bulge, or whether the Americans were actually really doing the heavy lifting in that campaign, which they were. Churchill was mending fences there and saying, yeah, the Americans are actually doing most of the fighting here and whatever like that. They've suffered more casualties than the Battle of Gettysburg. But at the same time, he was staving off controversy over the interference of his government in Greek affairs around the time that basically German influence was receding and a civil war was breaking out between leftists and right-wing factions that were basically engaging in civil war at this particular moment of time. He had this almost unhealthy obsession with Greece and with that particular region. But it mustn't be forgotten that in terms of the Irish contribution to the British and Allied war effort in the Second World War, there was a battalion of the Royal Irish Fusiliers that was deployed to Leros as part of this British incursion into this particular region, and that battalion was virtually entirely lost on Leros. They were assaulted full on by the cream of the German military, the Luftwaffe assets that they have in the region, as well as paratroopers, and then later ground forces that came in, and they suffered a lot of casualties. And there are at least 2 members of that battalion that went into captivity that were later forced at gunpoint to pull the bodies of dead German civilians out of the ruins of Dresden after the RAF basically firebombed Dresden into rubble in 1945, who were severely traumatized by both what they experienced on that island as well as what they subsequently experienced in captivity in German POW camps.
Ian, Leros, anything to say on the subject?
Yeah, I think we have to remember it's considered by some as the last great defeat of the British Army, and going on what Joe's just said, I think one of the things that strikes you it's this having air superiority leads to what happened on Leros, and we have to remember of the 3,500, 4,000 British troops, 3,000 of them were taken prisoner of war. So it is quite a significant dent in what happened, not just in Leros, but then the knock-on effects of other Greek islands, Samos and other islands such as that.
Yep, absolutely. I'm not going to say much about this. Is the creation of the Social Republic, the Verona meeting, Verona, beautiful town in northern Italy, and this was the fascist party's attempt to rebrand itself. And they declared, so this new political party based on the fascists declared itself to be a republican, and then got rid of the monarchy, declared the king to be a traitor, and introduced other rather startlingly left-wing perspectives. Have to remember that Mussolini started life as a socialist. Anyway, I'm going to move on. This is really a seminal moment in the war, because November 43, it's when Admiral Dönitz gives up the ghost on the Western Atlantic. And I put that chart in. That red arrow is roughly where we are now in 1943. So, and these are the number of submarines that U-boats have sunk by Allied action. So as you can see, early in the war, really quite small numbers, and then this enormous increase in the number of sinkings, basically in 1943. And Roger Morehouse got a splendid book. And I mean, his observations are extremely acute. He said, well, there was no real possibility for the U-boats to win unless they'd been deployed much more effectively earlier. And one of the things, of course, I didn't know is this Hedgehog anti-submarine kit. Do you see that?
Yeah.
These exploded on contact rather than, like depth charges. So when you see the films, you got the depth charges. But these actually made an enormous difference. That meant also it was the coordination with the air, and it was disaster. 75% of all U-boat crews died in the war. And in the November 43 Dönitz, look at those losses. I mean, they're just completely unreplaceable. And Dönitz gave up the ghost on the Western Atlantic. A tremendous victory for the Allied navies and air force, Joe.
Yes, I mean, you have to have a victory like this in order to pave the way for the invasion of Northwest Europe. I mean, it's not for nothing that basically you have the assembly of one of the greatest armadas that has been seen in modern warfare off the coast of Normandy. You have got air power, you've got submarines, you've got minesweepers, you've got everything vanguarding this massive armada to bring this large expeditionary force, Allied expeditionary force, to bear in terms of going into Northwest Europe, going into Normandy, liberating France from the north as well as the south. Because bear in mind, you have Operation Dragoon, you've got the invasion of the south coast with resources taken from Italy and from other parts of the Mediterranean as well. But the fact of the matter is that this key victory in the Battle of the Atlantic by the end of 43 paves the way for basically a conveyor belt of tonnage from Canada and from the United States to come across en masse, finish off the latter parts of this basically transatlantic mobilization of manpower, of material, of everything they need to build up for this invasion. They have to do this. And victory in the Atlantic is key. They can't have sort of effective wolf packs, of the Kriegsmarine prowling the Atlantic, preying on, Allied maritime tonnage coming across. They have to, get rid of this threat. And, in early 43, this was still, to use an American expression, a clear and present danger in terms of the Allied war effort. By the end of 43, this threat has been removed. And it's the introduction of basically not the introduction of new tactics, but a sharpening of pre-existing tactics, an extension of range, the employment of more effective armament. They're also purpose building these corvettes and these destroyers, in American shipyards and British shipyards to actually take the fight to the U-boats in a more effective way. And air power. Air power is absolutely critical. The B-24 Liberator in particular proves to be a game changer in terms of winning the Battle of the Atlantic. And it's electronic warfare. You've got radar detection. These U-boats are basically been blown out of the water almost as soon as they're deployed into the Bay of Biscay. They're not really even able to go out of port by the end of that year. And this is what's critical in terms of winning victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, basically neatly capping off that campaign and paving the way for what is to come on the continent of Europe, which is basically Allied liberation and basically a steamroller all the way into Germany.
Ian, Roger Morehouse said that the surface fleet of the German Navy achieved precisely nothing. And he argues that the Germans, at least at the start of the war in the late 30s, would have done better to invest more in U-boats. Is that a point of view that you agree with?
Yeah, and I need to give a shout out to Roger's book, which I've just read, which is Wolfpack, Inside Hitler's U-Boats War. This is a fascinating read in terms of learning more about the U-boats. I think in terms of where we were with the U-boats, that development in the U-boats early in the war would have helped the Germans massively. I think what we have to remember is the capture of the Enigma machines in 1941 and 42 really did pave the way to the other stuff that Joe was talking about, which meant that we were able to divert the convoys around the wolf packs and in some instances target those wolf packs. And it gave a completely different approach to the Battle of the Atlantic in doing that.
Okay, let's move on to 44. Greece. Very confusing because Greece, the Kingdom of Greece, was invaded and occupied by the Italians, the Germans, the Bulgarians, and the second map shows you the way that the campaign against the Germans, which eventually led to their decision to abandon Greece in November 44. I think it seems to me, looking at this, that the Germans were never really convinced that they wanted to be in Greece in the first place. Joe?
Well, it was never part of the plan for them to go into Greece in the way that they did, as I discussed in the previous episode. This was, the invasion of Greece was Mussolini. Mussolini had this obsession with Greece and with getting the upper hand of the Greeks. I mean, this goes all the way back to the Corfu incident in the 1920s. I mean, the Corfu incident is considered so serious at this particular point that the government of the Irish Free State even makes a comment of it is when it enters the League of Nations. You have W.T. Cosgrave, he's effectively Ireland's first Taoiseach. He basically makes a comment about it where he basically talks about, the need to deter aggression of any particular kind. So it's Greece that is taking the bulk of fascist aggression first from the very get-go on the continent of Europe in terms of countries that have been singled out for a malicious intent. And, the fact of the matter is the Germans wouldn't have really had much of an interest in Greece at all. It was seen, the whole Greek theatre was seen as a massive sideshow by Hitler, and it was seen as an unnecessary in Southern Europe, and holding Greece was necessary, and shoring up their Italian allies was necessary. But it was really one of these campaigns, like the Italian campaign, which sucked up a lot of resources for the Germans, very deliberately so. From an Allied perspective, it was very important to have these Southern European campaigns in order to divert the campaign, is what the Allies would have referred to it as. And there's another thing as well. I mean, you have to remember that on Crete, sort of the German airborne, part of the German military met their Waterloo on Crete. These were very, very tough people. They were very tough fighters. They were very resilient. The Cretan and Greek resistance were among the most successful internal resistance organizations operating anywhere on the planet in terms of counter-fascist warfare within occupied territory that you could possibly call upon. The Greeks were absolutely a very fierce, very resilient, determined enemy, and also Greek civilians, particularly Cretan civilians, they had an attitude towards the occupiers that it was kind of a nonchalance in the face of severe atrocity and severe suffering. The nonchalance was it spoke to centuries of occupation under, the Turks in previous centuries. And it was almost as if, like, in spite of their sufferings, they were almost laughing at it. They would say an awful lot more ably and with more of a stiff upper lip than a lot of their European counterparts in many respects. They really put their Western European counterparts to shame in many respects.
Ian, the Greek campaign, fair to say, do you agree with me and Joe that the Germans really didn't want to be there in the first place?
Yeah, they didn't. And I think the other thing we need to remember is there was certainly a significant amount of conflict between the Germans and the Italians on the Greek islands. I think it was Kefalonia, perhaps, where the Germans massacred a large contingent of Italians because they weren't following orders and as the withdrawal took place. So I think positionally the Germans didn't want to be there, but they were trying to shore up and keep the Italians in check, and that then led to other problems.
Absolutely. 44, I'm moving on quickly now because we're out of time. This is the obscure story, not often told, of Albania. So Albania's unhappy history, well, it only created in 1914, the Principality of Albania, and it was divided and invaded in the First World War. It was admitted eventually in the League of Nations in 1920, became a proper country, became a republic in 1924 with Zogu as its president, but then it became a monarchy with Zugani in April 1939, occupied, partly at least by the Germans, September 1943, and liberated by the partisans. And let's move on to one of the characters. Completely forgotten. Enver Hoxha was regarded as being the most peculiar of all European communist rulers. And he emerged from real obscurity. He was reasonably well educated and became a communist state, head of government of Albania. From this moment, 1944, all the way till when he died in 1985.
Interestingly, I've just come back from a visit to a visit to Greece, but we went into Albania. I think one of the things we have to remember, again, like Greece, this was a place where the Germans had to shore up the Italians, and in 1943, when the Italians surrendered, Germany went in some force to try and establish itself. And the Italians, I can't remember which division it was, one of the Italian divisions actually switched sides and went and fought with the resistance against the Germans. And it really took control of the southern part of Albania, and that work that Joe just talked about with Yugoslavia. I think it's really a fascinating part of the war that really didn't have a wider impact, but the internal politics is quite fascinating, and how it becomes.
Yeah, there was a British mission there, and they had identified Hoxha as an effective Nazi anti-Axis, just as they've done with Tito. So he's a byproduct. A very inconsequential person. There's nothing about his personality that you think would justify his status. Look, we've come 1945. Charlie Gaulle this week, in the second week in November, gets elected as the president of the Provisional Government of France. We're not going to take him on at this point. So I think we've covered a lot of ground. Any final words before we finish?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, going back to the theme of remembrance, because this is a remembrance-themed episode, and without saying too much, I just thought that the remembrance ceremony that took place at the Zenitaf on Sunday was, this is not the first time that the King, in his capacity either as the Prince of Wales or as King, has led a Second World War or First World War themed commemoration, national commemoration. I've seen him lead the national commemoration of the 80th anniversary of D-Day at Portsmouth in 2024. And indeed, in the year 2000, when I was still a teenager, I saw on Sky News as he unveiled the opening of the Pegasus Bridge Memorial and the new Pegasus Bridge Monument and Museum, wearing the uniform of the Parachute Regiment and wearing indeed the cap of the Parachute Regiment, and he gave his speech in both French and in English. And this is, we're talking about a member of the royal family, the King, the head of state of this country, who has a deep, intimate connection. Having unfortunately suffered the loss of his mother and his father, who were connected with the wartime generation. He's the last serving and living royal to basically have this level of connection with the wartime generation, in terms of both those that he knew and as well as those that he served with when he served in the Royal Navy himself. What I was reflecting on was his countenance during Remembrance Sunday, without saying too much. Of all the remembrance services and services of this nature, in terms of leading national remembrance of both World Wars, but particularly the Second World War, I think this was perhaps the most significant of all, for reasons that I can't really put my finger on. And I think that his leadership of national remembrance, particularly in terms of Second World War commemoration, is something that people should in this country take note of. And I think it's something that he deserves all due credit for.
Very nicely put. Ian, any thoughts on last word on commemoration? Taking into account that the Princess of Wales is doing her bit, she's the honorary colonel of several formations, including the Irish Guards, and Duchess Sophie, Prince Edward's wife. She was Royal Irish Regiment honorary colonel. I met her by the way, you know that Sophie's mother's called O'Sullivan. I don't know if you know that. So she's part Irish. We're always looking for the Irish angle. But the women are playing their role. And of course, Camilla's father, I got the Military Cross twice. And she's very engaged in Second World War history. So I think, although your points are well taken, I think there's still enough energy there. And I think really it's up to the grassroots. It's people like us to put pressure on and saying that we need to have a new approach to memorialising, particularly 1945, the greatest moment in British history. And we need to step up, and it's going to be the children of the veterans who are the ones who are going to tell the stories now. Ian, any thoughts?
I think my only last thought on this is that we, as historians, as those interested in history and conflict history, as those authors, we are the ones that have to tell these stories to our next generations and leave those memories with our next generations, and stress the lessons that need to be learned and the commemorations that need to continue to keep those lessons front and centre.
Thank you, Ian. Wonderful final thought. So what I'm going to do now is going to say goodbye for the moment to you both. Thank you for another great episode. Covered a lot of ground. Insights are wonderful. Thank you, Ian, for your pithy contributions. Really appreciate it. We must have you on again because, you got another insight coming in. It's really good. So thank you very much. So I'm going to say goodbye for the moment to you both. And I'm just going to close the show. So that's it. The second week of November. We covered the dates in 1939 to 44 and 45. And again, the fascinating insights and very important developments. So that's it for today. We'll be back next week around this time with the next episode of This Week in the Second World War. So until then, from me, from Joe, and from Ian, it's goodbye, good luck, and may God bless you all.